Ball pythons are one of the most popular pet reptiles in probably the world. But because they're so common, a lot of people think that they are easy to care for. But the reality is that ball pythons are one of the best examples of how bad or outdated information can become normalized in the reptile hobby. Uh, hey, I'm Clint with CrossStar Reptiles, and today we're going to be taking a look at some common ball python myths and mistakes, as well as how we can care for these animals better and how this sort of applies to reptiles in general. Ball pythons regularly reach a length of 3 to 5 feet. Yet for many years, breeders talked about keeping them in 40-gallon aquariums their entire lives. Um, and I know, that there's a lot of debate over terrarium size or, what size enclosure to keep the ball python in. And I know many breeders use rack systems, and there's a lot of debate over the ethics of that. But I understand that for breeders who are breeding several hundred or several thousand of these snakes, they can't keep all of them in 4 by 2 enclosures, which is what I recommend. They have to use those rack systems, and I get that, even if I don't like it or agree with it. That I understand it. But a 40-gallon aquarium, a 40-gallon glass aquarium, that kind of enclosure does not allow for proper movement. I mean, again, you're talking about a snake that reaches 3 to 5 feet regularly. They can't even, completely stretch out in a 40-gallon aquarium. Um, and with glass aquariums, it's almost impossible to allow to keep humidity up. And for that size, you can't even get the right temperature gradient. Ball pythons, because they are what we would call ectothermic, and they can't regulate their own body temperature, they need a temperature gradient. They need a warm side temperature of about 86, 88 degrees, and a cool side temperature somewhere around 80, 75, 80 degrees, so that they can move back and forth between those spots to regulate their body temperature. With a 40-gallon glass aquarium, you can't do that. You're going to have you're not going to be able to give that snake the temperature gradient that they need. And then for long-term health, that kind of enclosure is just not adequate. I recommend a minimum of a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot enclosure for adult ball pythons. Now, don't get me wrong, juveniles, you could probably keep them in a 40-gallon for a little while. But for an adult ball python, you're going to need something much, much larger, something that will allow for proper thermoregulation and just natural behaviors. Um, I build custom enclosures, and I recommend PVC enclosures. And the reason for that is when you have glass aquariums that have those mesh lids, you can modify them to hold humidity better, to retain heat better. But a PVC enclosure basically provides its own insulation. And when you get them sealed right with the right substrate, you're going to be able to hold humidity and temperature much more consistently in a PVC enclosure than you can a glass aquarium. On top of that, a glass aquarium, unless you have covered it, it's exposed on all but, on all but the bottom. And so that can make a snake feel stressed because they don't feel as secure. Whereas a PVC enclosure, you have it enclosed, on all but usually one side. And so that helps to give them a much more stress-free environment. And when you can provide a stable environment that reduces stress, then that supports feeding, healthy feeding habits and prevents a lot of common health issues. Um, it also helps the humidity. Ball pythons really need humidity around 60% at all times. And that is something that I think is essential because when you keep your humidity regularly around, 60%, then you're going to prevent shedding issues. You're going to prevent some digestive issues and things like that. Um, and by doing that, by having the right enclosure with the right substrate, and I would recommend something like ReptiChip or ReptiEarth, um, substrate or a mix of, something like Repti earth and sphagnum moss, um, organic topsoil and sphagnum moss or Repti earth, something that is going to hold the humidity very, very well. Um, back in the day, they always talked about misting enclosures. And for some reptiles, that's great. Like with, chameleons, you have to mist their enclosures pretty regularly because that's how they not just keep their humidity up, but that's how they get their, how they hydrate themselves. But with ball pythons, we found that misting can actually cause respiratory infections. Um, and when you mist, you miss the enclosure and you come back in an hour or so, and it may have bumped the humidity up temporarily, and then you come back an hour or so later and it's back down to where it was before, because misting is just a temporary solution. Really, misting should not be done at all with ball pythons or snakes, because it can increase the chances for respiratory infections and respiratory issues. Instead, getting the proper substrate in the proper enclosure and then pouring water into the four corners of that enclosure so that it keeps the humidity up regularly. Now, you don't want to soak your substrate, because then you can run into issues like scale rot where they're sitting on wet substrate all the time. Um, but by having the right substrate and then adding water into the four corners of your enclosure, it can keep your humidity at a consistent level. And while I'm talking about that, with your humidity gauges, if you're using those little analog dials that you can get at pet stores, the best thing you can do is throw those away and get a digital hydrometer that measures the humidity and temperature with a digital format. Those little analog dials are all but useless. And move your humidity gauge down near your substrate. A lot of times we'll have the thermometers and humidity gauges up real high. And I don't know if you can see my enclosures behind me. These are most of my ball pythons, part of my reptile room. I have multiple thermometers and hydrometers in their enclosures. I have some that are up high, but the ones that I rely on the most are Govee digital Wi-Fi enabled smart thermometers that I have down very near their substrate, because it doesn't really matter what the humidity is up in the top of the enclosure in the air. What matters is what the humidity is reading down near the substrate, because that's where your ball python is spending most of their time. Now, if you had an arboreal snake or or arboreal lizard, something like a chameleon, then it would matter what the humidity is up in the top of the enclosure. But with ball pythons, it does not matter what it is up top. You want that reading to be down as close to the surface as possible. So move your hydrometers down to very near the surface of your enclosure. Don't miss, get the right substrate, and then add water to the corners and keep adding water. Add water and then wait, 24 hours or so, check your humidity, see what it's at. If it's still low, add more water into the corners, and then keep doing that and checking every 24 hours or so until that humidity comes up to where you would like it to be. You want that to be maintained throughout their enclosure all the time around that 60% mark. And when they go into shed, you can bump that humidity up to 70 or 80%. It's not going to hurt anything at all for that humidity to go up that high. You just don't want it to stay up, 80, 90% all the time. And the reason again for that is that could lead to other issues like scale rot, where your snake is sitting in or sitting on very moist substrate all the time. And if you notice that you're still running into issues with stuck shed, I have one of my snakes that was a rescue, and when I got her, she had some scars on her, and sometimes she gets stuck shed where those scars were. So you can take one of your hides and soak sphagnum moss. Excuse me, I seem to be struggling with my words today. But soak some sphagnum moss in some warm water and then put that in the hide on the warm side of their enclosure. and then that will create a humid hide that they can go into and will help with shed as well. And then if you still notice that there are some issues, then you can take them out and give them a warm soak to help them get some of that stuck shed off. Um, but honestly, maintaining that temperature, I mean, that humidity around that 60 and 70, 80% mark during shed will dramatically reduce the problems that you're going to have with shed. And again, I talked about temperature gradient already, 86 to 88 or some would say 90 degrees, but I would say no more than 90 degrees on the warm side of your enclosure. And the reason for that is ball pythons can actually start to display some neurological symptoms once your temperature gets up over 95, 94, 95 degrees. So you want that warm side, I say between 86 and 88, and then the cool side between 75 and 80 degrees. Um, and again, reptiles, they rely completely on their environment to regulate their body temperature. And so if the enclosure is wrong, if it's too hot or too cold, or if it's not hot enough or not cool enough, then they can't compensate because they can't come out. They don't sweat. So they can't do things like we do or like mammals can to regulate their body temperature. Um, and something that's extremely important is just because you have had one species of reptile doesn't mean that you can treat all reptiles that way or that you have all the knowledge that you need to take care of others. The care for a ball python is very different from the care for, say, like my Ackie monitors. Care requirements vary by species. My Ackie monitors, they require a very, very hot basking temperature. My juveniles, they bask at about 130 degrees. And then, up to adults, 160, 165 degrees for their basking site. And so that's very different than, say, a ball python, or I have crocodile skinks. Crocodile skinks, my red-eyed crocodile skinks, they require a very cool, shaded and humid environment. Um, if I were to treat my crocodile skinks like my Ackie monitors, they would die because they are very susceptible to something like heat stroke and uh, so I can't treat the different species of reptiles the same way with the same type of enclosure, the same enclosure setup, and things like that. And so when you're getting ready to set up your enclosures, that's something that you need to decide. What species am I going to take care of, and make sure that you are tailoring your enclosure to that species rather than just a general setup. I know a lot of pet stores, you'll go in and they'll sell these general reptile kits, and it'll have maybe a basking light or a UVB light, or some of them unfortunately still throw in heat rocks and things like that. Um, and not everything fits every species. So, you need to research, make sure that you have the right equipment for the right animal. And when we're talking about heat and setting up your enclosure, you want your heat to come from things like radiant heat panels, ceramic heat emitters, or deep heat projectors when we're talking about ball pythons. Um, Ball pythons should not have basking lights. Ball pythons should not have those red or black or blue night lights. For ball pythons, their heat should never come from a light source. Um, and that's different than lizards, for example, or basking species like my Ackie monitors. They need a basking light. But ball pythons should never get their heat from a light source. It should come from radiant heat panels, ceramic heat emitters, or deep heat projectors. Um, and while we're on that subject of heating pads, hot rocks, really, you shouldn't use those with ball pythons either. Um, I know for many years, and a lot of people still use them, and I would say, with heating pads, as long as they are controlled by a thermostat, that you could use those. But so many people don't go the extra mile of buying a thermostat to control their heating elements. And whether you're using a radiant heat panel or a ceramic heat emitter or a deep heat projector or a heating pad, I would say every heat source that you have needs to be controlled by a thermostat, because unregulated heat can be fatal. It can kill your snakes. It can cause irreparable neurological damage if it gets too hot. Um, and hot rocks, whether it's for a lizard or a snake, throw them away and get a different heat source. Those hot rocks are terrible, um, and they can cause burns, and I just don't recommend them at all. Um, but whatever you're using, you need to have it plugged into a thermostat. And the red night lights that are still being sold have been found to disrupt the natural circadian rhythms of reptiles. Um, they can still see that red light. For many years it was thought, well, they can't see the red light color, so we can use that for heat lights at night. You can't. Get rid of the red heat lights, switch them over to a ceramic heat emitter. A ceramic heat emitter doesn't emit light, it just puts off heat, and that will allow you to maintain the temperature in your enclosure 24/7. So you can have the right heat gradients, you can have everything set up, and so that it's a 24/7 consistent temperature in your enclosure. Um, and those under tank heat pads, you can use them if they are connected to a thermostat. You would just put your thermostat probe between the heat pad and your tank, but don't set it any higher than 95 degrees. And understand that a heating pad will not affect the ambient temperature of your enclosure. Um, it's just going to create a hot spot for them to sit on. Um, so you're still going to need something like a ceramic heat emitter or radiant heat panel, deep heat projector to control the ambient temperature in your enclosure. So I would say it would be better, rather than putting your money into heating pads, to go ahead and get it, invested in something like a radiant heat panel or ceramic heat emitter that you can control with a good thermostat, something like a herpstat. Try to avoid the cheap thermostats that you see places like Amazon. Get a good quality thermostat that is going to be safe for your animal. Um, and I said already that your ball pythons should not get their heat from their lighting. And again, that's different from like lizards or other snakes that may bask. Ball pythons are not a basking species. In the wild, they spend the majority of their time in burrows. Um, However, they do still need a 12-hour day and night cycle. So they need light on 12 hours a day and then off 12 hours a day. Just like you and I, reptiles, they determine whether it's light and whether it's time to get up and move around based on the lighting. We use the sun and the moon and all that good stuff. So they still need to be able to see that it's day and night. Um, I use grow lights in my enclosures for my ball pythons, and because they are bioactive enclosures, so I have plants in there, and so the plants benefit from those grow lights. You can also put in UVB lighting. Now, ball pythons don't require UVB lighting. They get their calcium from the bones of their prey. But some research has shown that even though they don't require it, they can still benefit from it. Sorry, we had an equipment malfunction there. But what I was saying is, with ball pythons, you want to make sure that their heat is not coming from their lighting, but they still have a 12-hour day and night cycle to help maintain their normal rhythms. I use grow lights in my enclosures because I have plants in there. All of my enclosures are bioactive, and so it helps with that. And then they're all on timers, so that way that their daily patterns and routines are consistent. And you'll notice that your snakes are they get used to those routines. And ball pythons in particular are crepuscular, meaning that they are most active at dusk and dawn. And so that's when I feed. I feed my snakes right at dusk every Monday. And so, they already know on Mondays at dusk, they're out, they're active, they're looking for food. They know that's feeding time. And so you want them to be able to maintain those routines. And so I recommend using some kind of digital timer. Um, and again, heat for ball pythons should not come from their lighting. Other species may require both UVB and basking lights, like my AccuMonitors. Um, they are. I use mercury vapor bulbs for my monitors because that maintains a very high basking temperature. Use Retez stacks for them so that they have a variety of basking temperatures. Um, and then a mercury vapor bulb also gives UVA and UVB lighting in addition to a hot basking site. Um, Whereas, like my crocodile skinks, um, they have a very, very low level UVB because they don't really need it, um, but they do benefit from it. But their temperatures, their hot side is around 80 degrees, whereas my monitor, his basking spot's 130. Or my Leachianus geckos, they don't require a very high basking temperature. Their basking site is about 84 degrees, and their ambient temperature is only about 77 degrees. Um, and it's because of the different places in the world that these animals come from. So I say that because a lot of times we think, and it's told, basically general reptile care, that you can do these things for every reptile species. And while that is true for certain things, not everything applies to every reptile. Um, and so that comes down to doing the research for the animal that you are caring for. And with ball pythons in particular, that's what I have the most of. Um, One of the things that I think is important is what you are feeding your animal. That you are using a quality food source. Now, I recommend for feeding frozen thawed. Um, the reason for that, for me, it's easier to buy frozen thawed to keep them on hand, to keep them stored, rather than going to a pet store week in, week out to have to buy so many because I have so many snakes to feed. Um, and honestly, feeding live sometimes, the snake that I was talking about earlier that has scars, it's from being bitten by a rat. So if you are not feeding live, then you don't have to take that risk. Um, Now, I would say with juvenile ball pythons, you should start them out on rat fuzzies because the rats provide better nutrition than mice, and then move them up according to their body weight. As the snake grows, so does their prey. A ball python can eat prey about 3 times the size of the largest part of its body. Um, and I have a care guide that I would give to anybody who would subscribe to our channel and leave a comment for what species they want. I'll send you the care guide. And in the ball python care guide that I have a chart based on the weight of the snake and what size prey you should be feeding. Um, but again, different reptiles have different dietary needs. My monitors eat mostly insects. Whereas my lychee geckos have a prepared diet that's crested gecko diet. Whereas others may eat vegetables or fruit or things like that. Um, One of the biggest issues that I see when it comes to reptiles and keeping them and their care is impulse buying. Um, we need to avoid impulse buying at shows just because, or at expos or pet stores, just because we see an animal that is really cool. We need to make sure that we have all of the things prepared before we bring an animal home. And loving these animals and caring for these reptiles means being responsible for them. Good care begins long before the animal ever comes to our home. Um, and again, I said this in my last long video. I love these animals. I've been passionate about reptiles since I was a kid. And the things that I'm talking about are not to pass judgment on anybody or to, condemn what somebody else has done, but it's just to give good information. Whether you are an experienced keeper who was given bad information like I was, or you're just getting into the reptile hobby, I want people to be educated. I want to foster a curiosity among kids like I had when I was young growing up, and didn't really have any, YouTube wasn't around, and there wasn't a whole lot of information out there about reptiles in general. And so, I want to be able to give good information to anybody that cares about these animals as much as I do. So, again, I'm Clint. This is CrossStar Reptiles. Subscribe, like, comment, let us know what you think. Let us know if there are things that you would like to see, like to hear about. And I hope that you will continue to join us on this journey. Again, this is CrossStar Reptiles, and we're just getting started.